Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this Achates Live, which has been pre-recorded for broadcast on Thursday, the 14th of September. Today, we're going to be talking about planning and delivering successful capital campaigns, exploring examples of how organisations have developed and delivered their campaigns, the successes and challenges that they've faced, and what they've learned along the way. My name's Deborah Larwood, and I'm the Director of Development here at Achates, and I'll be chairing today's discussion. Achates is a creative consultancy with a holistic approach to providing support with fundraising, recruitment, strategy, business planning and evaluation. Our name is taken from Greek and Roman mythology. Achates was the close friend and loyal advisor to Aeneas, and we think our name quite neatly describes the relationship that we offer to our clients across the cultural sector. Achates Live was first established to support the sector and to bring fundraisers and other arts professionals together to discuss the key topics and also enable you to help and support each other. And whilst we acknowledge that Achates doesn't necessarily have all the answers, I think what we do have is an overview of the sector itself, and we're so passionate about using this perspective and role in the most supportive way. And finally, just to say that all of the information shared in today's conversation is, of course, live and correct at the time of broadcast. Now, capital campaigns. The early stages of any new capital project are exciting for an arts organisation. The prospect of being able to develop the scale and technical quality of your artistic programme, to improve your audience's experience and to deepen your engagement with them, to increase your earning potential, all makes the scoping process so inspiring. Most exciting of all may be the opportunity to express your vision in bricks and mortar, glass, concrete or steel. And the possibilities aren't exactly endless, but they're certainly many and varied. But when it comes to realising these plans, piecing together an early understanding of where the funds are likely to come from in order to complete the works is absolutely vital. And within this, there must be a clear understanding of the full project costs, both construction and non-construction, as well as the timeline and the plans for programme delivery during the course of the works themselves. Only once all of these elements have been drawn together can a fundraising target be identified and a strategy then be developed. The turbulent economic picture, which has been further impacted by the pandemic and Brexit, of course, have collided to put delays to numerous cultural sector capital projects in the recent years and have significantly driven up costs. It was announced only last week that the capital budget for the Aviva Studios in Manchester has risen a fifth time, and this time by some £22 million. And in some cases, these delays and challenges have completely thwarted organisations' plans. Capital fundraising is a complex canvas, and even more so perhaps for organisations which don't have an extensive, primed, well-established donor base who will be warm to a project and therefore quicker to convert into capital gifts. Establishing a new fundraising campaign to run concurrently with revenue fundraising also requires very careful sequencing, as the adverse effects of a capital campaign on revenue fundraising really can't be underestimated. Here at Achates, we recommend taking a combined approach, mobilising a parallel revenue strategy that will allow capital fundraising to be maximised whilst ensuring sufficient revenue funding during a period that is likely to see increased operating cost. Like many funders in the trust and foundation sphere, whilst the National Lottery Heritage Fund funds capital works, its key interest is around the benefits that a project will bring to heritage, to people and to communities. Therefore, a capital campaign case for support now more than ever must articulate the social impact and the sharing of heritage. It's also worth noting that when engaging a funder such as NLHF, it will also to some extent dictate the timing of your project. For example, projects cannot go beyond REBA 3 in the development phase, and for large-scale grants, the sign-off for NLHF at each stage can take as much as 6 months. And as invoices cannot be retrospective, this can be problematic in terms of cash flow. So these issues and considerations are important, but what I've shared so far has barely scratched the surface of today's topic. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our panel today, two cultural sector professionals who come from organisations which have undertaken capital projects in the last 2 years. And I'm really delighted that they've agreed to join me to discuss their own learnings and experiences. So first up, we're joined by Kate Foster, Head of Development at the Royal West of England Academy. Kate's been working in fundraising and marketing for over 30 years now, having started her career in sponsorship at the Scottish Ballet in Glasgow, and since then worked for tourism marketing, fundraising for environment and health, as well as the arts. Most recently, Kate and the RWA team have raised over £4.6 million for the Light and Inspiration Capital project. The work carried out with funding from the National Lottery Heritage Fund, amongst many other funders and donors, has transformed the RWA's austere Victorian building, with 200% more visitors now coming into the building than previously. Thank you for joining us, Kate.
Hi there, it's lovely to be here. Hi.
Wonderful. And second of all, just to introduce our second panellist for today is Wendy Cook, Head of Cinema at Hyde Park Picture House in Leeds. So since 2006, Wendy has been Head of Cinema. In that time, she's overseen a move towards a more open and inclusive approach to operating the Grade 2 listed cinema, growing both the breadth of its programme and its audience. Since 2014, she's focused on the delivery of a major refurbishment project at the venue, which has helped to bring the much-loved historic building in line with the needs of its community today, as well as creating a sustainable and secure future in which it can continue to adapt and grow. And the expanded and updated cinema opened in June, so really recently. It's fantastic to have you with us too, Wendy.
Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. So we're going to start today's discussion by asking both Kate and Wendy to share a little bit about their organisation, their capital experience and their insights in relation to developing and delivering their campaigns, the successes and challenges they faced and what they've learned along the way. And once we've heard from both of them, we're going to jump into some questions. So Kate, I wonder if I might come to you first.
Sure. Bear with me a moment. I have some notes here, which I'll sort of refer to. I think that the last few years have been quite a blur for me, so it's sometimes a little bit difficult to remember what we did and when, especially against the backdrop of COVID, whilst we were trying to do the project. So I joined the RWA in 2016 and raising money for the capital project was in my job description when I joined. And I was looking for something that would give me a next step in my career. And so this seemed like the right job to go for. From my first visit to the RWA, I could see how much potential it had. It's an amazing building in a fantastic location, but it wasn't in a great state, especially the first impressions from the outside and downstairs of the building. It hadn't had any major work done in 100 years. However, my brief on joining was just to raise money to make improvements to the massive roof lanterns over the galleries. Because the temperatures in the galleries got very, very hot in the summer. They were single glazed. And this was impacting both on our ability to borrow historic loan works of art that go in the side galleries because the temperatures were just too hot and were going higher than the strict parameters allowed. And it was also too hot in the galleries from a visitor perspective, as well as for anyone who thought of hiring the galleries for an event. So an application was put in 2015 and we put one in 2017 to the Arts Council for a small capital grant to replace or to do something about those roof lanterns. We were turned down both times, and actually in hindsight that was a really good thing because both of these applications were around about £300,000, which actually, as it turned out, wouldn't have even covered the costs of the scaffolding. After that, having been turned down twice, we had no alternative but to look at a lottery application, and I think we were a little bit resistant to that at first because we knew that it would be so much more work. In the first instance, I secured a resilient heritage grant that was about £10,000, and that meant that we could work with a local firm of architects who put together a crack team of conservation architects, structural engineers, thermal experts, among others, who then came together and they wrote a report on what we needed to do to mitigate those high temperatures, which recommended that we actually take off the old single glazed roof lanterns and replace them with new thermally insulated ones with openings. That report underpins the whole capital project. First of all, it got us the listed building consent that was really useful. And it also paid for a cost consultant whose estimate at that stage was that this work would cost £600,000. The big stumbling block, and the cost consultant did a timeline as well, was that we would have to close the galleries for 6 months just to do this work. Now, we don't have any public subsidy. Actually, that's a lie. We have 1% public subsidy from Bristol City Council. But if we were to close for 6 months, we knew that we needed to look at all the other areas of our business that we needed to address that would move us forward. My particular bugbear was the bins on the forecourt. We're located in this amazing location at the bottom of White Ladies Road in Bristol. And the first impressions of us just weren't great. You know, to ask someone to part with £8 of their income when the building just looked so forlorn, it just wasn't working. And I always joke that we spent £4.6 million just to move the bins. But actually, I'm really pleased with what we've ended up with. It just looks so good. So in the first instance, we worked with a consultant, Sophia Merchandani, who supported all 3 of our lottery bids, and she was brilliant. And it was third time lucky with us. Again, in hindsight, failing at the first 2 lottery bids was a good thing, because by the time we finally got it, the project had spent 3 years more in the gestation and was the better for it. We were lucky in the lottery at the time, 2018-19, changed their criteria. And because we had been through those previous rounds, we actually had an oven-ready project ready to go. And so in the words of the lottery, I think we were green lighted through because they knew that we were ready. But in the lead up to this, obviously over those years, we had been talking to other funders. We had applied to the Linbury Trust for £80,000, and they actually pledged £100,000 through a connection we had with Sir Jeremy Isaacs, who I spent a very interesting morning talking to. I had been to see a local funder, the John James Bristol Foundation, to understand why they weren't interested in funding an application for about £5,000 for some elements of our learning programme. And just on my way out of the door, I just mentioned that we were thinking about a capital project, and long story short, they agreed to a grant of £305,000, which we sort of matched against another application to the Arts Council for small scale capital. And this was, the Arts Council wanted a project that could be done independently of the main project if the lottery bid didn't come off. So we put an application to them for the works to the forecourt and the frontage of the building to improve the first impressions and the visitor experience. I think we had a really strong business case for that for the reasons I explained earlier. So having got this sort of £600,000 already pledged, this was crucial to our lottery success, and we finally got that first round pass in 2019. I had as well been talking to the Wolfson Foundation, and so they were tentatively lined up for the works, and once we got that lottery seal of approval in 2019, they came in with a grant of £150,000, and this was then followed by a lot of other trusts and foundations and pledges from Garfield Weston and Foyle. So we had the biggies in the bag, pledged, all convinced that, you know, once we had that seal of accreditation from our lottery funding. So at this stage, after we'd got the round 1 pass, we worked with a local fundraising consultant, Nancy Chambers, who advised us and supported us on our major donors campaign. We were very fortunate, really, in that we already had a pool of patrons who were very loyal to us, and we had sort of kept them on board all the way through. You know, we had been talking to them about the campaign since 2017, you know, talking about our ambitions, where we had got to. So, you know, by the time we had got that round 1 pass from the lottery, it was absolutely no surprise to them what we were planning to do. During this time, the pandemic had hit and we were all working remotely on the project, which included putting in the round 2 bid. I was also involved with my background in marketing in writing the marketing plan, and for the first time we had the resources to really look at that and do some number crunching. I was also involved in working with the head of finance on writing our business plan, which I really enjoyed, writing the digital plan, which was centered around the better use of a CRM system to aid fundraising, and moving our website onto Shopify to improve e-commerce. I was also responsible for working with the evaluation consultants. And that was a really good part of the project, actually, for the first time, knowing that we had all the stats and data that we needed. And I think that has helped me enormously since on writing a lot of those bids that I'm now doing. We ran one crowdfunder campaign with the Art Fund, which raised £23,000 to build and kit out our new family room, which was formerly our staff office. I think that crowdfunder campaign, as so many are, was great from a marketing point of view, but actually it was such hard work to raise £23,000. In hindsight, just having 1 year between our development and delivery phases was really short, and probably did impact negatively on staff being, and you know, as I've mentioned before, the backdrop of COVID and supply issues in a build and escalating costs. I think, Deborah, you mentioned about having clarity on costs before you start. Well, we certainly didn't have that, and they were increasing by the day. So that was a real challenge, which meant actually that we were forced to run a second crowdfunding campaign. This time we ran it with Crowdfunder, who I've used before, and in many ways that was a lot easier. Our consultant Nancy had managed to secure a grant of £50,000 from a local trust, and we used that to match the crowdfunder. So the crowdfunder target was £100,000. Obviously we only had to raise the 50 once we had that trust money. We paid an additional commission to crowdfunder, and they matched it at the point of donation. So for every £1 that people put on the platform, they could see another £1 come in, and I think that was an incredibly powerful motivator for our crowdfunder donors. And then finally, we had a shortfall of about £250,000, and the lottery agreed that we could put in a top-up bid to them, which apparently is really, really unusual. But I think the whole situation was really unusual, and we had demonstrated that we had tried absolutely everything, and we needed that money to finish the project, so we were successful in that. We reopened in May last year, and it was an incredibly busy time getting the new cafe in. Fortunately, I've been speaking to some potential tenants, recruiting and training a whole new staff team, because in the 2 years during COVID that we've been closed during COVID and then during the capital project, a lot of people had got better opportunities and or reassessed their lives and moved on. Finding new products for the shop, and all the reporting and thanking and recognition that we had to do for donors has taken probably, you know, the best part of the last year. So it's just the day job now. We're committed to delivering a really ambitious business plan. When we officially reopened, the head of the National Lottery said, and now the hard work starts. And I just thought, oh no, I can't do this. And she was right. Yeah, it's been very challenging, and if anyone can help me find some core funding to carry on the ambitious engagement program that we started as part of the lottery, please speak to me, because I would love to hear. But yeah, that's pretty much it on it, and I'm yeah, interested in hearing from others. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kate. That's you've really taken us through. I feel like I've got a really good understanding of what that process looked like, and you know, I take my hat off to anybody running a campaign like that over the course of a pandemic. I think you've made some really brilliant and really valid points around timelines. So, you know, thinking about, for example, that the lottery process that you've gone through, and, you know, sort of the third time lucky, as I think you described it, actually that's, in essence, that's a long process of cultivation of a funder. Meanwhile, you mentioned, of course, that you were also beginning to talk to your patrons way before the plans had actually sort of reached the stage of sort of mobilizing fully. quickly. So, and I imagine that that has absolutely played into you converting some of those individuals into capital donors. And then on the other side of the project, in your closing words about that longer term stewardship. So if we think about that sort of arc of a journey with regards to sort of cultivation and stewardship, it really, the capital project itself obviously has its own time frame, but you can wrap around that pretty quickly, a much longer time frame to enable you to, you know, to maximize your campaign success. I also liked what you were saying about the idea of sort of leveraging the matching opportunity, both to galvanize trusts and foundations, but also individuals. And it'd be great to talk a bit more, I think, in a little bit about the crowdfunding appeals that you did, and how those matching messages worked and what the considerations were as well. So yeah, lots more to talk about. Thank you so much. And Wendy, let's hear from you around the picture house.
Yeah, so there's lots of points in Kate's kind of experience that feels very familiar, and a number of points where it feels like we diverge. Sorry. So a bit of context: the Picture House is part of an organisation called Leeds Heritage Theatres, which was established in the 1970s and operates the Picture House alongside Leeds Grand Theatre and Opera House, and also the City Varieties Music Hall. So three quite unique and, you know, wonderful but also challenging heritage buildings. The charity has had a historic relationship with Leeds City Council, but is kind of arm's length and independent. At the point of closure for COVID in 2020, we were, similar to Kate's experience, we were 1% funded through sources other than earned income. So projects like the Picture House project, our relationship with funders there, they're quite unusual to us. We're not an NPO, even though we are an arts-based charity. We just had small, low-level ongoing income coming from a couple of sources like Leeds City Council's Arts at Leeds grants, but we didn't have a development team. We have never had a development team within the organisation or a dedicated fundraising resource. The two theatres have had historic capital renovation projects, but they were both led by our local authority, with the organisation very much kind of taken along for the ride rather than, I think, leading. I think that would be a fair thing to say. And I think both those two renovation projects are about 10 years on, and whilst they were major projects with large scale investment from the National Lottery Heritage Fund, they weren't projects that resolved all of our issues. And our two heritage theatres are still kind of, you know, dealing with ongoing capital challenges. So I think going into the Picture House project, it felt kind of quite unique to the organisation in that it was a capital project that we were solely leading on a venue that we had kind of complete control over, which was, you know, both a great opportunity because it allowed us to really, I think, learn from historic capital projects, but also a challenge in that it's not easy. We started the work, I tend to start the dating in 2014, which was the Picture House's centenary. So on the decade leading up to that, we'd done a lot of work to try and make the Picture House a viable going concern. We do have a historic deficit position. We were trying to work on, you know, diversifying our income streams, getting on top of health and safety and all the kind of necessities of the building, which is at that point a grade 2 listed single screen cinema with no accessible toilets, stepped access at the front. The fabric of the building was in a state of disrepair despite sort of all the effort to kind of maintain it. We had no sort of internal breakout spaces, no capacity for kind of learning spaces. Our entire sort of secondary sales offer was done via a very small kiosk that could house two volunteers. That was historically a fireplace. So in terms of diversifying income, we had limited opportunities, but we did manage to sort of double our attendance between 2004 and 2014. We also managed to introduce private hire income, merchandise, improve our secondary sales. Despite all of that, we showed that within the confines of the building and the confines of kind of the team that building could house, we couldn't turn it around, which is where we kind of then came to what we need really to think about the next 100 years is a major kind of capital change. So in 2015, we began working on a feasibility study. We were lucky at that point in that we had some seed funding from our Friends of group, the Friends of Hyde Park Picture House, who were established in the 1980s very much as a sort of lobbying pressure group. They helped move us into the charity that we're now in, Leeds Heritage Theatres, helped, put pressure on the council at the right times, helped put pressure on audiences at the right times, helped to kind of champion us. Over the kind of 10 years leading up to our centenary, I think their role had moved a little bit away from being that sort of public advocacy group, because actually we were in a better position. We were sort of functioning more stably, but they continued to sort of generate income and raise funds, and were able to build up a little bit of a this kind of bank of money which we were able to use to pay for a feasibility study, working with a fantastic consultant called David Clark, who had historic experience with other sort of cinemas like Chapter in Cardiff, but also had known the Heritage Fund, knew kind of the Film Council as was, Arts Council, had worked with all these kind of bodies and understood the landscape between heritage buildings and cinema infrastructure as well, which was a particular little niche that we needed to kind of exist within. And David was brilliant because he helped then to help us to bring in an architect, bring in kind of the right engineers to help look at what was possible and build that feasibility study, which then fed into and was the backbone of our round one bids to the National Lottery Heritage Fund, which we submitted in 2016, submitted and secured in 2016. So we were very lucky at that point that we did get a pass on the first time we kind of went in, which we in no way expected. And I don't think anyone else did either. I think we were very lucky in that we were, I think, viewed as a relatively small project at a national level. So we went into an LHF nationally rather than sort of regionally, but we're at the low end of the national kind of projects they were looking at. We were also, geographically located in the north, within a city, but within a suburb of a city, serving kind of a really interesting and diverse audience. So I think there were a lot of really nice elements to our project that made us kind of quite lucrative. We also, because we were applying for capital and activity, and the two, I think, were very holistically linked. And I think that was one of the critical things for us right through the whole capital project, that we have at every stage been able to really clearly kind of explain and evidence with consultation with audiences, with actual kind of activity data, that the changes to the building were fundamental in terms of unlocking how we could serve our community, and were essential really. And without it, the Picture House would have really struggled, I think, over the next decade to continue to survive. Certainly kind of going through COVID, there were points when I sort of reviewed our viability, because I guess I'll go back to the timeline. We were delayed due to COVID. So we had our round one pass in 2016. I thought we would hopefully canter through our development phase pretty quickly. We were wrong, as I think is, I guess, the common thing. We ended up needing to do some additional surveying work to try and explore some things like the foundations of the building to really get all the information that we needed. And then obviously working through those surveyings, working through the solutions to them took us longer than we hoped. So while we were hoping to begin the work in 2019, complete in 2020, we ended up going back into the Heritage Fund with our round two pass in late 2018, and we didn't then get permission to start until 2019. So we weren't able to actually begin on site until what should have been early 2020. We were meant to begin in March 2020, and then it actually was May 2021. We were then meant to be on site for 1 year, but we ended up taking 2. So I think in terms of our experience of knowing all of the costs, having a really robust risk register, making sure that you kind of predicting all of the challenges, it felt like in the development phase we did all that. it felt like we ticked all those boxes, worked through it. We were incredibly rigorous. We had a fantastic team of architects and engineers working with us. But you know, the joy of heritage buildings, we discovered some things that we didn't know were there. And COVID also kind of didn't help, rising costs due to inflation. All of these things have kind of compounded, which meant that we did, eventually open in end of June this year, when it should have been a year before. In terms of that COVID period, so the substantial delay for us was when we closed for COVID, we hadn't actually signed our contract to start on site, so we were able to pause at that point to understand what the situation was. But then our organisational funding became unstable because, as everyone did, all of our income went away. So the board sort of really wisely, with the fantastic support of all of the key stakeholders in the project, supported a pause on the project until we were able to re-establish the organisational position and be confident about kind of starting on works, knowing that we were able to finish. We did in that period secure a capital kickstart award through the Heritage Fund to top up our funding and help manage some of those additional costs due to that delay. I should say, sort of in terms of other funders, certainly similar to Kate's experience, we had to kind of secure some of those big ones in the early days. I think having the seed funding from the Friends of Hyde Park Picture House allowed us to do the work to then secure the Heritage Fund. Securing the Heritage Fund then allowed us to secure Leeds City Council, which were kind of critical. So obviously they're, you know, under so much pressure for funding as all local authorities, but we're, you know, a vital partner. I think getting that civic support made a real difference to us. That allowed us to then secure £100,000 from the Garfield Western Foundation, some other sort of chunks from the Gwynedd Forester Trust, Pilgrim Trust, and a number of other smaller trusts and foundations along the way. We had a plan that we would always look at a public giving campaign, but always towards the end of the capital period. So that was something that we held off on for as long as possible. We ended up running it in December 2021, which at the time felt like it was just when we were about to reopen. And I think that's where I think one of the challenges that we had on site was that with the fundraising, was that we ended up running that public giving campaign and then had further delays. So we had a very successful campaign, very much conceived and led by my marketing communications manager, Ollie Jenkins, who did a really wonderful job of just telling the story of the project and giving people a real sense of how their money could help make it possible. You know, distracting from the fact that yes, we have had some millions here, but we really need your £10, which was such a difficult balance. We were able to secure £60,000 through that winter fundraising campaign, which was really fantastic. On top of that, we've received another 20,000 ongoing low-level donations from our audiences, and I think that ongoing low-level donations from people who are kind of invested in the organisation feels really critical to us in terms of that legacy funding. It's low level, but it's achievable. And I think similarly to Kate, sort of during that process, we've done things like look at our CRM strategy, invest in a more comprehensive box office system. We're with Spectrix now, not just for the Picture House, but the whole organisation, which is allowing us to look at how we are working with data support fundraising. I think it feels like a lot of these lessons we're learning too late. And I really wish that I had known so many things at the beginning of this. But I think coming out of the capital project, we have survived. And it's going to be really interesting to see, you know, working on Kate as a year on, I think how we do bed this thinking into the next stage.
Wonderful, thank you so much, Wendy. Yeah, what a thrilling ride in some senses, but I can imagine, yeah, hugely challenging. And as you say, much like Kate's experience, I think that the chaos that ensued following the pandemic, you know, for any organisation going through a capital project, I think even without a pandemic in your midst, any capital project, you know, there are always things that you don't quite know that you wish you did, and so on and so forth. I wanted to just pick up on your point about feasibility. Certainly at Achates, we're really passionate about organisations doing that groundwork and investing in those feasibility pieces of work, so that as much as possible you're really clarifying the sort of the detail of the project, and really thinking about, you know, how you're going to, you know, realise that work, and financially as much as anything else. Your point about NLHF I thought was really interesting, in the sense that you were saying that your capital and activity asks were linked, and actually you were positioning your project as being a way to unlock how you can serve your audiences. And I think that goes back to what I think I was saying earlier, that it is fundamentally about, you know, people and place as much as it's about the fabric of the works that you're undertaking. I think the point about organisational stability is also one that, you know, I really encourage anyone watching to think carefully about, because for any funder, they're going to be very interested in how stable your organisation's finance, how resilient you are as an organisation, as you're taking on essentially an additional risk as you're undertaking a capital project. And then finally, your point about the sequencing, I think it's interesting that you started with that investment from the Friends, that, you know, that then you sequence that, followed by the statutory funding, which then unlocked trusts and foundations, and finally the public campaign. I think I completely agree. I think in a sense, though, those investments can serve as kite marks and help to open further doors. So I guess for anybody thinking about where to begin when planning the sequencing of their capital fundraising, I think, Wendy, you've made some really important points there to consider. So I've got a few questions that I'd love to put to you both, if I may. And you both sort of touched on things you maybe wish you had known, or surprises that came along the way. And I guess my first question is, what would you say are the fundamental foundations required for launching a capital fundraising campaign? And what do you wish you'd known at the beginning? Kate, can I come to you first on that?
Yeah, sure. I think I'll just reiterate what I said before, really, which is having that core or pool of loyal supporters. We were lucky at the RWA in that we had 70 or so patrons. And these are, you know, potential major donors, people who have the ability and propensity to donate, and we carried them with us from the start. I wouldn't want to take all the credit for this, because, you know, we were riding on the shoulders really of some work that had gone on previously as well. So I think that the need for the project had been talked about for a very long time. So we weren't having to do a huge case to persuade people, but you know, it was definitely a slow burn that we referenced all the time. And I think you made a point earlier, Deborah, about the fact that although I talk about COVID and lockdowns as being an issue, trying to deliver the project during that, of course it did mean, and I hadn't really appreciated this, that we didn't have our exhibitions program to talk about. So, you know, the capital project and how it was progressing and our need for funding was the main message of the day, and it was something that the marketing team could focus on. So we were very lucky in that respect. But yeah, just to say, prepare the ground well with all your audiences, and yeah, if you do already have a pool of people making a donation and who are loyal and committed to the organisation, that is just gold dust.
Absolutely, thank you, Kate. And Wendy, you mentioned that similarly, I think that around 1% of your income was contributed as opposed to earned. So what are your thoughts about perhaps what you might wish you had known, or what you feel those fundamentals are for that successful campaign to roll out?
I think one of the things I wish I had known at the beginning is, and wish I'd done differently, was I think changing the way that I worked with colleagues around the fundraising. I think because we are an organisation, as I said, that didn't have a development team, didn't have a lot of past experience with fundraising, despite having individuals in the organisation who had done a lot of legwork around fundraising. We had a wider learning engagement team who had managed a historic relationship with the Emerald Foundation, who are local to us. So there were pockets of good practice and knowledge, but it wasn't something that as an organisation we were very experienced with, which consequently meant that dealing with the particulars of the process of working with funders, the particular kind of like needs and demands of it, the time frame of it, and the expectations of funders, I think were all things that we as an organisation weren't massively experienced with. And then because I was kind of leading on it for this project, I wish at the early doors I had got much wider organisational buy-in on those particular challenges and demands, because I think what ended up happening were, when there were points when really I needed that wider input, it was almost too late to kind of share the load. And there wasn't that kind of like organizational like base of knowledge and awareness, I think, that could have made it easier. But that is something that we are sort of learning, and now I think there is a different sort of attitude towards like fundraising and delivering funded work within the organization, in part due to our capital project, but in part due to we did secure CRF funding as an organisation through the Arts Council during COVID, which obviously the nature of that, you know, necessitated absolute organisational buy-in, including at board level, which I think was, you know, really valuable. So I think that just building a better base really would have been helpful within the team.
Yeah, that's so interesting, Wendy. And I think, you know, we certainly talk at Achates a lot about building a culture of fundraising within the organization. And in a sense, you are sometimes cultivating your own colleagues in order to then gain their support in terms of the way in which they can support or contribute to the fundraising work of an organization or around a campaign. That's it's quite a nice lead in, I think, to my next question, which was actually about the board, your board of trustees. I'm interested to find out a little bit more about the role that they played. Of course, as part of their remit and responsibility, they'll be, I'm sure they were very focused on the sort of the detail of the works themselves and the risk register and so on and so forth. But what did their engagement around the fundraising campaign look like? Did they lend their support on a personal level? Were they utilising their networks? How did that play out? Kate, I wonder what your experience of that.
So the board were fully engaged with the project from the start. They knew that something had to be done. We couldn't carry on as we were. So at the very start, we had some facilitated workshops with Safina Merchandani, where the board agreed on the priorities for the capital project. And I think this was at the point where, you know, it was agreed that as well as the roof lanterns, we needed to do the forecourt and first impressions and visitor experience work. We had, because of the length of the project, we had to carry on with some of those facilitated workshops at a later stage because members of the board had left and new ones had come who didn't really know the project. So many of our boards are patrons as well. So, you know, they contributed to the major donor and became part of the Circle of Light and Inspiration, which was fantastic. The biggest challenge, I think, initially was to get them to pledge some of our very limited reserves. I remember speaking very passionately at a board meeting to say how important it would be for other funders to show that we were taking a risk and you know, backing ourselves by putting some of our reserves. It was about a quarter, I think, of our limited reserves into the project, and there was quite a lot of resistance to this because obviously we don't have many reserves and we don't have MPO, we don't have very much at all. I think I remember speaking quite passionately about the fact that I didn't want to go down in history as the person who squandered the family silver, and that I would do my utmost to raise enough money to make sure, or to try and make sure that we didn't have to use that, and I think obviously they backed it and they voted it through. So having for them to pledge a proportion of our limited reserves was really important for funders. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Kate. And Wendy, you talked a little bit at the start of your introduction about the structure of the group within which your organisation sits. So tell us a little bit about what that meant in terms of board engagement, and actually were you able to lean on perhaps some of the stakeholders in the other organisations in the group to maybe open some doors?
I'd say I think I was very lucky in that I had the support of our CEO and the absolute backing of him, I think, from the early doors of the project actually. And when he came in at a point when we were we'd already done the feasibility, we were starting the process. He was new into the role, at a point when you think about, de-risking, you could say, actually, let's just not. But he really got on board and then was critical in terms of the advocacy at board level, because I think whilst the board are, passionate about the Picture House, we're one of 3 heritage venues that they are responsible for, with, such, a significant range of challenges across the board. So I think as much as they, want the Picture House to thrive, it can't be at the expense of any other area of our work. And there needed to be some balance. And I think having the CEO kind of help to kind of go on that journey and take them, and give me a platform as well to sort of take them was really kind of critical. He gave me a lot of time at board level, created a subcommittee specifically to work on the Picture House, which then gave me room to, bring in some critical friends who could help provide insights and back up what we were talking about. We were also kind of very lucky around that point that we were able to recruit a new board member who sadly has passed since, Fiona Spears, who came from Heritage Fund North, so who had specific experience around Heritage Fund, but around heritage building projects. So I think we were very lucky that we had that advocacy from the CEO, but also were able to bring in some key people to the board. At that point, we had vacancies and we had great candidates who were able to really understand the particular potential of our capital project and sort of reassure the wider board that going through that funding process, there were risks, but that it was worth it. And then I think in terms of that, wider work they did to support fundraising, similar to Kate, kind of it was critical to have them sort of underwriting at kind of some points, taking on board risk. Also kind of engaging with not just the project on a financial level, but on a capital level, sort of really interrogating the capital risk register. We also recruited a board member on that point who had specific experience on capital works, which was also really critical in terms of a heritage fund. I think being able to show that the board needed to see that we were doing everything right, but the heritage fund needed to see that we were doing everything right with our board as well. So I think getting the 2 things sort of working really kind of compatibly was critical. And we've just recently gone through board recruitment again, sort of with people kind of ending their tenure, and now have brought in someone who has more fundraising experience, someone with audience development experience. So it's really exciting to see now how I think the board is on a bit of an evolutionary kind of journey to sort of better support this type of project going forward. And I'd like to think that the Picture House project has been part of that learning, hopefully. Don't ask them.
It sounds as though it has, Wendy. That's fantastic. So you mentioned National Lottery Heritage Fund, and obviously the Arts Council have very recently opened up their capital grants programme in this funding round, and NLHF only very recently have announced their new 10-year strategy. So we know that there are lots of organisations who are in the throes of their capital campaign planning and thinking about funding sources, including, of course, NLHF. And since both of your organisations successfully leveraged NLHF support, I'd be really interested to ask you if there are any challenges around the process. Kate, obviously you've mentioned sort of, third time lucky, but are there any learnings that perhaps you didn't know before that you might share, or perhaps any insight into how the funding potentially shaped your project and its delivery, if at all? Kate, I'll come to you on that one first, if I may.
Yeah, sure. Yes, I mean, lottery funding definitely changed the project. I'm sure we wouldn't have had such an ambitious engagement programme had we not had lottery funding to do it. And I would say one of the learnings is that we were probably too ambitious. I mean, it's just fantastic that we managed to engage 8,000 people so deeply, but I'm not sure that the lottery necessarily expected us to do all that much. I think we put a lot on ourselves, and that was in our evaluation, is that actually we didn't need to do all that, and I think we could have been, and in some areas of the building as well, we could have been more robust with the lottery and saying, actually, you know, we can't do this, because we did deliver an awful lot for their money, well, for everyone's money, really. I think on the plus side, we might not have delved into our history of the RWA had it not been lottery funding. There are some amazing stories that have come out of that. Our amazing founder, Ellen Sharples, who was such a woman, and we'll be doing more on her, an exhibition possibly next year. I think what was really good about the lottery funding is that their very rigorous approach to us, that, you know, their demands and all the things that we needed to do in order to apply stood us in very good stead with other funders. There were several, I can't remember names, but definitely quite a few who I spoke to who were very reassured by the fact that we had that lottery approval, and said, well, you know, if it's good enough for lottery, it's good enough for us, because they know that we will have done all the business planning, audience development work, all the planning consents and things that we needed to have done. And I think it was very good for us, actually, having done all that work that the lottery required of us. It made for a better project.
That's great to hear, Kate. Thank you so much. Yeah, it does sound like it required a much more holistic approach. And also, as you say, all of that rigor ultimately is the right thing to do, because it will pay dividends in terms of seeking other funding as well. Wendy, how about you? What's your take on that?
I think that, I mean, yeah, similarly, the Heritage Fund have been absolutely incredible for us, and an amazing funder. And I think working with them sort of through COVID, especially, they have been so supportive and flexible and accommodating, and that amazing combination of the rigor alongside, they also want what's best for us, for both the project, but then I've found that there's a real kind of care for the team delivering. I think what I wish that I had known is, I feel like delivering a capital project is the perfect experience to learn how to deliver a capital project, which is an absolutely terrible way of learning. The Heritage Fund, you know, everything kind of they expect, all of the kind of processes around reporting, managing the grant, kind of risk, all these things are really incredible, as Kate sort of says, thorough processes to learn and adopt and build into your organisational work irrespective. And I think going through this process with them, you know, guided by them, and we've been lucky that we have had a mentor since our round one pass. We've had the support of a mentor through them, who's been really kind of helpful to help us not just tick the boxes of the process, but actually learn it as we go. And I think that's been really interesting. And I think similarly to kind of Kate's experience, the confidence people gain when you realise that the Heritage Fund are there as a supporter. We've also found it really useful with funders, but I'd say kind of critically for audience, it's been very important to us as well. I think the Picture House is a very beloved historic building, as you know, a lot of historic buildings are, but I think we have a particularly opinionated audience who really care, and I think they're the audience who really, you know, used the building, understood what was wrong with it, but also were terrified when we started to talk about the project. And I think being able to go on this journey, and at every point where there was worry, be able to say, oh no, the project, our core funder cares about the heritage. Our core funder is supporting us to do this work, allowed us to really just like quell so much concern amongst that really important stakeholder group of audiences, which, you know, obviously is linked to our crowdfunding campaign, the sense that we were doing everything we could to care for the heritage nature of the building, whilst also adding in new spaces, new facilities, modernising. So I think they were a really fantastic seal of approval on a couple of different levels for us.
Fantastic, Wendy. That's brilliant. And actually, you just mentioned the crowdfunding, and I think one of the things I'd love to just pick up on, really, as I guess my final question for you both is, both organisations have included that sort of crowdfunding larger scale appeal as part of your capital fundraising work. And I'm interested in what you think the opportunities and perhaps challenges around revenue fundraising look like post capital. Wendy, obviously you're much earlier on in this sort of part of the journey than Kate is, but what are your early thoughts about what the capital project and the fundraising you've done might mean for fundraising into the future?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's already been really helpful in allowing us to secure future funding. So we currently have a 3-year funding agreement through Film Hub North, who distribute BFI funding, which is kind of really great, and that's very much keyed into audience development, our engagement activity. And I'd say that was possible because of all of the work we've done, all of the learning kind of on the capital fundraising scheme. We're in the first year of that, so that is kind of 3 years from now on, which is amazing, and that's something that we couldn't previously have dreamed of. And certainly the activity that we will be delivering as part of that is only possible because we have the flexibility of the new and improved building. So it's taking, I talked before about how the building unlocks the activity. This is us kind of starting already to see the reality of that. I think in terms of ongoing kind of low-level public giving, having a more comprehensive box office system, building in messaging about kind of our activity, there's some good building blocks I think that we have there to try and make that a steady but small kind of ongoing income stream. But I think for us it's very much about a robust and diverse set of income. So a little bit of public funding, a little bit of individual donations, building strong ticket sales, private hires, all of these things. It's being able to build a really holistic business model that doesn't rely too heavily on any one revenue source. And that's, I think, our plan for the future.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that's absolutely it. And I think, what's brilliant is, clearly, as you say, the building, the space is much beloved by many people. And, you've obviously assembled a community of supporters around making the project happen, and maintaining those relationships will hopefully mean that, they might continue to support at a level that's meaningful to them well into the future. Thank you. Kate, how about from your point of view, what do you think your capital project has meant for and continues to mean for your revenue fundraising?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a challenge because we had such an ambitious engagement program that we need to raise quite a lot of money to continue it at that level that the lottery did fund. It was interesting to hear about, yes, how the building enables future revenues. So we got a grant from the Art Fund's Reimagine round of funding to engage and to carry on that work with some of the Bristol's most vulnerable communities, and that was by the fact that we'd got a new lift, we'd got changing places toilet facility, and all those access things that we didn't have before, which has meant that we can do that. So that's funded us for a year to carry on some of that engagement work. We didn't get MPO funding, which was a bit of a blow, which we had hoped for, to have that stable core of funding. We are in the process of going back to some of those previous funders. I've got an application at the moment to the National Lottery Communities Fund to see if they will carry on some work that was started by the Heritage Fund. So we'll wait to hear on that one. And some of those other big funders like Garfield West and some of the local funders as well, to see if they'll carry on with doing the work that the capital project enabled. But yeah, it's certainly a challenge. We had an appeal recently with our friends, and we managed to raise the money that we wanted. It was only small scale, but we've definitely, with sort of individual giving and those low-level donations, I feel that we have asked so many times. You said earlier about the effects of a capital appeal on some revenue funding and the adverse effects, and I think that there are areas, yes, I'm hoping that with the great evaluation of impact that we have, that'll stand us in good stead with trusts and foundations, but it remains hard work.
Thank you, Kate. Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think, yeah, it's undoubtedly any capital fundraising, there's always a risk that you are going to drain your revenue base and you will need to lean heavily on that base. I suppose it goes back to, for any organisation thinking about their capital planning and their campaign planning, to really think carefully about how they will continue to sustain their revenue fundraising and where they might need to take that in terms of as the capital project comes to its close, and which capital donors can then be, as you say, Kate, potentially converted into longer term revenue supporters. It's a meaty topic, and I think I probably knew we were never going to cover every single base in an hour, but I feel like we've had a very good deep dive. However, I'm afraid I'm going to have to wind up our conversation today for now. So first of all, I just want to say a huge thank you to both Kate and Wendy for giving their time and being so generous in sharing their very recent experience, which I think has been incredibly insightful and really, really valuable. So here at Achates, we offer a range of services, including recruitment, fundraising, strategy and organisational development. And we do a lot of work with organisations who are indeed planning or delivering capital projects. So if you'd like to discuss how we might be able to support you, or if you'd just like to speak to a member of the team, then do just drop us a line at info@achates.org.uk. And finally, just to note that our next Achates Live will be on Thursday, the 12th of October, on the topic of crowdfunding. And there'll be more details to follow on that soon, of course, so do just keep an eye on your inbox. It just remains for me to say thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you back with us next month. Goodbye for now.